Hey, it's Jim, and this is level 3 of the CFA program, the topic on private wealth management and the reading on topics in private wealth management. This is part 3. We just quickly remind you that in part 1, we talked about the tax implications in private wealth management. Then we shifted to concentrated positions. Now in part 3, we're going to focus mainly on estate planning. There's an interesting paragraph that begins this section of the private wealth management reading in which the Institute informs us that we're probably, as good financial analysts, not going to be required to structure things like a trust or an initial public offering or any of those other ways that we talked briefly about, the sale of family businesses or trying to transfer wealth from one generation to another. But, and I think this is really important as we go through this slide deck, is that the Institute says that we're going to be required to identify the periods in our clients' lifetimes under which they need some good estate planning. I've said this before. The Institute doesn't want us to be estate lawyers, but they want us to be able to identify those estate planning needs of our client. All right, we've done those LOSs in part 1 and in part 2. So we're down to the final 2 LOSs in this super fun reading. We begin with a couple of definitions. I'm guessing that you guys know what a will is and what a probate is. Look down at that fourth one there. If a person dies without a valid will, they are said to have died intestate. And so then we need to make sure that we go through the intestacy laws of that jurisdiction. Of course, the legal system plays a crucial role, and I'm guessing the way the Institute will present this to us on the exam is inside of the beginning of the question stem, give us some of these definitions and tell us where they live and what kind of rules and laws and how that particular jurisdiction handles probate. Let's distinguish between common law and civil law. I'm wondering if you don't know this just by regular reading of People magazine, which I don't do anymore. But common law, you can put together, these whole legal documents at their own discretion. Civil law, there are tremendous limitations, or at least there can be tremendous limitations on the testator's capacity to dispose of their assets. So here, let me go back just quickly. So I guarantee you, boy, that's tough for me to say, right? Who knows what the Institute is going to do? But I'm suspecting with a strong probability that in the question stem, you'll see those two words, either common law or civil law, and here you'll have the distinction between those two definitions. Now, if we are struggling with a civil law problem, then we're going to be asked to solve that problem. And so how do we do this? Well, there's a 1 and 2. So we can do an offshore trust and we can make gifts and donations. This estate planning is very, very focused on trust planning. And so we need to know just a little bit about trusts. They're commonly used and how they can achieve certain goals. Now, remember, we're inside of the policy statement, so we need to swing back to the risk and return objectives inside all of the constraints of each individual client. So the trust, look down at the bottom there. Trust can either be testamentary, where it's created after the settler's death, or it can be inter vivos, where it's established during the settler's lifetime. So I'm guessing that the Institute is probably going to provide us with, an ultra high net worth client, and we're probably not going to want to go to the first route. We're probably going to want to go through inter vivos because we want to make sure that we plan on all of this. And then we'll talk about foundations here in just a few minutes. So how do we do this as wealthy individuals? We can do this one of two ways, essentially. We can do it during the course of our lifetime, or we can do it after death. And then after death, there are probably two possibilities. After death, if there is no will or no directions, well, then, it's kind of a free-for-all, anarchy maybe. So that's why we need, a will, and we need gifting throughout the lifetime. I know that my father, before he passed away, he was just delighted to gift his grandchildren $10,000 each I think that was the rule back back before he died, and he got great joy out of doing that. And I imagine the Institute will probably have a sentence or two indicating in the question stem that something like, here's this wealthy individual, and they want to spread their wealth to their grandchildren or great grandchildren, and they get tremendous utility out of this. Lifetime transfers are oftentimes called lifetime gratuitous transfers because they're made without getting anything in return. Now, of course, my father, really all he wanted was a handshake and, hey, Pop, I love you in return, but they don't want anything that is, financial in return. Now, of course, the issue here for us as good financial analysts is that we need to worry about taxation. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in a world where the government wasn't really interested in wealth transfers, but the government is very interested because they, of course, want to collect their fair share of taxes through things like, capital gains and dividend and interest income. And so the transfer of wealth from one generation to another has to reflect those kinds of taxations and taxation laws. Now, remember, we had a slide up, I think it was back in part 1 of this reading, where we distinguished between flat rates and progressive tax rates. And so these, of course, apply to inheritance taxes or estate taxes just the same. Now, remember that here in the United States, there's this gigantic exclusion for the first, multiple millions of dollars that is not subject to the tax. However, to the estate tax. However, make certain that you read about the different municipalities inside of a federal government. Here in the United States, each state has its own ability to impose estate taxes, and I imagine it's true in provinces or states or other municipalities throughout the world. Yeah, look at that second diamond point. So there's an exemption or a threshold amount, which I was talking about. They could be lifetime, they could be periodic. And we need to worry about this concept of excess capital so that we can do it during the lifetime or do it after the death. Now, using the former, let me go back here quick. So this is during the lifetime, that these tax-free exemptions are probably beneficial because those amounts then will probably grow to extra future values or more future values, and we'll see that here in just a few slides. But look at that second diamond point there. Gifting earlier can reduce the amount subject to future tax. So remember, we're not just worried about the individual wealthy client's tax liability. We're worrying about the entire box of wealthy client and then all of the heirs or the beneficiaries of the transfer of wealth. So how can we do this? Look at the bottom circles: gift tax, income tax, tax-free compounding. The way these things work is that we're going to take these and we're going to just throw them in to some pot and say, what's most beneficial for us as an entire unit? Think of this unit, this family unit, or whoever the heirs or the beneficiaries might be. Tie that into what we talked about in the beginning of part 1, where what's our goal? Our goal is to minimize the tax liability. And of course, back in that part 1, we were generally focused on minimizing the tax liability for the current tax year. But now we're trying to minimize the tax liability over a lifetime or perhaps, some extended time period, 5 years or 10 years or maybe 20 years. So this is what I was saying earlier about marginal costs and marginal benefits. I mentioned that back in part 1 and part 2. Do we gift now or do we do it after death? And, these are always unpleasant conversations. Although, before my father died, he was a super fun guy. And he used to tease my sister and I about things like, what are you going to do with all my money? And my father died with a very modest estate. But he had a lot of fun with it. And it really helped my sister and I out in terms of helping him make these decisions and, and putting him to rest, assuring him that we were going to do all the stuff that he wanted to do. In fact, one of the cool things that he did is that he asked us to gift 3 of his really, really close friends after death. And And it was really emotional kind of an experience. So look for that kind of stuff inside of the question stems. So the question then becomes, what was my example? Marginal costs, marginal benefits. Well, what we're going to do is, instead of doing this thing here, like that dude here, we're going to put it in a ratio. So there's relative value of a tax-free gift. There's the RV on the left-hand side. And all we're going to do is have a numerator, and we're going to have a denominator for the gift and the bequest. And so we need to figure out what those values are. So when we go to the next slide, we'll see these equations. Now, look at that LOS. It asks us to discuss strategies. And so it sounds an awful lot like we're going to have to discuss the strategy on the exam. And I'll do this at the end of the slide deck, when I refer you to the end of reading problems, you're going to have to make sure that you're able to calculate these too. So my advice is to get at your phone right now, take a picture of this slide so that you can memorize these two formulas. So there's the numerator at top. Notice that we have a 1 plus, right? So we're compounding. Also notice we have in parentheses a 1 minus some tax rate. So that's exactly like we've done from the very beginning of level 1, when we were trying to figure out some kind of after-tax cash flows for a company. And then we have an RG. So look up there. That's the expected pre-tax returns on the gifted asset. And then down at the bottom, there's an RE, the expected pre-tax returns inside of the estate. So make certain that you distinguish between the RG and the RE on the exam when you have to calculate this. And then down at the bottom, we need an estate tax rate, and then there's the N for the expected time until the donor's death. And this is always a tough one. When my father was healthy, we would always say something like, what, Dad, you're going to live until you're 95 or 100, and he would say, no, I'll be dead next week. So it was a battle between kind of a comedy inside of the family. But then when he was diagnosed with this cancer, we knew that death date was way sooner than what we had hoped for, of course. So that N, which will be given to you in the exam, of course, but that's a tough one in practicality and in the pragmatic dealings with estate planning. Now, of course, if you put the numerator on top and the denominator on the bottom, you get that relative value in the top gray box. Maybe you should take a picture of this as well, although I'm not quite sure you need to, but you probably need that second gray box. So the top one is if the gift is tax-free, but if it is a taxable gift, then you need to throw in an extra tax rate down there on the bottom. So look at the decision rule. If the ratio is greater than 1, then we're going to make the gift now. If the ratio is less than 1, we're going to leave the asset somewhere, and we're going to leave those to our beneficiaries or our heirs after death. Now, let me go ahead and warn you, when you look at the problems at the end of this reading, the Institute gives you 2 clients. One client, you calculate this ratio, it's over 1. One client, you calculate this ratio, so it's under 1. So I mentioned that just to illustrate that, of course, even though the LOS says discuss, the end of reading problems asks you to go ahead and calculate, get an answer greater than 1 or less than 1, and then go ahead and discuss. And that discuss probably means applying that decision rule. So let's go ahead and start with an example. We have a seasoned professional with a decision of transfer a portion of her wealth to her child Henry. So whether making lifetime gifts or a testamentary bequest. All right, so expected time of death, 25 years. And by the way, if you do the math and you do, like 27 years or 23 years in there, that time period is really not too sensitive unless it's, 10 years versus 25 years. All right, pre-tax return 10%, tax rate 30% for both Kate and Henry, so that's important there. Estate tax rate is 35%, so go ahead, recommend the most suitable choice. All right, so that links back to the LOS of discuss the strategy. So note here in this question, we've come up with recommend, and that's probably what you're going to be asked to do on the exam. So in the next slide, what we've done is we have color-coded these so that you can make sure that you distinguish on the exam. So there's the pre-tax return of 10%, that's in red. The effective tax rate for both Kate and Henry, that's in purple. And the estate tax rate is in, I don't know what color is that, orange. So look down at the bottom green box. So we put that relative value equation there. And we've linked the red colors and the purple colors and the yellow colors or orange colors, and we get a 1.53. So what are we doing? A lifetime gift is more tax efficient. Now, the easy question for the Institute to give us would be saying something like, here's a column of a couple of different clients, and here is their RV ratios. And then somewhere in the question stem, they'll say, what are we going to do now or at bequest? But I think it's more likely that they're going to go ahead and ask you to calculate this RV, mostly because it shows up in the end of chapter problems. All right, so the math is pretty easy, but we color-coded it just so that you can make sure that you don't make the mistake. Don't substitute the purple for the orange. All right, so how do we accomplish these gratuitous transfers? So we can do it with trust, which we started a little bit back in part 2. So when you have a trust, you have to appoint somebody, an individual or, a group of individuals who act as the trustees. And so what happens here? So our client, who will be the settler, they take the assets and, there we go. We got the hand and they just kind of throw them into the box, which we'll call a trust. And then the trust fund manager manages all of those assets on behalf of the beneficial owners of those trust assets rather than the settler or whoever the legal owner is. I tell my students all the time, I say, look, this is what you need to do when you grow up and get jobs. You need to go work for a financial institution or start your own financial institution and open up a big sign and say, hey, I'm a trust fund manager. And what people do every day is they just throw money at you and say, here, find something to do. Now, of course, that's kind of a silly explanation and a rudimentary understanding of what a trust fund manager does. But I convince my students that, man, isn't it awesome if somebody shows up at your desk every day with $5 million, and it's your job as good financial analysts to act as a steward of that capital. All right, 2 types of trusts here. So revocable and irrevocable. Those have specific regular meanings, but they have unique and specific legal meanings. So with a revocable trust, what you can do is change your mind. You can say, here, let's go back here. Here we are. We're throwing all these assets into the trust. And at some point we can say, you know what, we faked you out. We want those back. All right. So what happens in a revocable trust, the settler retains that legal ownership of the assets. So we need to worry about the tax implications and reporting purposes of those revocable trusts. And then look at the green bullet point there, vulnerable to creditors or legal claims made against the settler. So lots of times we just throw this into an irrevocable trust, which means you can't change your mind. Let me go back here quickly. You throw those assets into the trust and they stay there. Even Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You guys ever watched that great 1969 movie, Paul Newman and Robert Redford? Even those two really handsome guys and really fun guys who robbed banks, even they can't get their hands on those assets. Although if you read the Wall Street Journal regularly, which I recommend to you, you'll see people trying to sue to get their hands on those assets. And, it doesn't hardly ever happen. Trust can be structured as being fixed, which tells us that the beneficiary is going to receive a fixed amount and a fixed timing. So maybe it's a monthly payment of $10,000 for, X number of years. Discretionary means that the trust fund manager can say, you know what, I'll give you $10,000 today, but I'm not giving you anything until 5 years from now. Or. And so generally, it's at the discretion of the trust fund manager. But of course, the trust fund manager doesn't make the decisions based on his or her discretion. It's based on the needs and well-being of the beneficiary. But notice at the bottom there, the beneficiaries do not have the legal right to the income or the assets. It's up to the discretion of the trust fund manager. And so, of course, this ultimately leads to a protection of those assets from creditors. All right, here's a really good exam question. What are the objectives? So control, that makes perfect sense. Asset protection, and then tax-related considerations. Go back to everything that we talked about back in part 1. All right, let's go ahead and look at a couple other ways to do this through a foundation. So think about this. I won't go back to that earlier slide. So what did we do? We had a hand, and we threw that into a trust, which was, some legal entity created for the beneficiary, usually by a financial institution. But you can do the same kind of a thing. You can take the hand and you can throw the assets into another box. It's not called a trust, but it's called a foundation. And so typically you know about these foundations. I mean, there are lots and lots of wealthy individuals that you read about every day who have their own foundation that was established usually by an individual, but most likely by a family. And then the family then appoints board members to go ahead and oversee the investments and the distribution of this. And so what happens then, that the donating family then has control over the management of the assets. So, there's an income tax deduction, there's advantageous tax treatment, and there are the shielding of assets from estate taxes because they're inside of the foundation. And then, of course, the foundation then continues to exist long after our client or the settler's death. Read the Wall Street Journal regularly, you'll find, here's a foundation, and the original founder donated all this money and said they want to do, promote X, whatever it is. And then, 50 years after his or her death, we find out that the foundation is not only not doing X, but they're doing Y and Z and something else. So, all fun stuff. Life insurance, we know all about life insurance from our regular lifetime. We pay these premiums and we have a death benefit. But of course, life insurance is a tremendous tool to be used in managing wealth and transferring wealth for generations, because what you can do is, instead of throwing assets into a trust or throwing assets into a foundation, and remember, those assets could be almost anything. I mean, they could be shares of stock. They could be, I'll go back to my example from part 2, a miniature golf course, and they could be anything. But with life insurance, we're going to actually pay cash premiums. I don't think my insurance agent would accept a putter or a golf ball from a miniature golf course in exchange for a payment. And so what we can do is we can then dictate who is the beneficiary upon our death. Now, the reading doesn't go into too much detail about whole life insurance policies or term policies, so that's probably a conversation for a different one. All right, so what are these benefits here? This is just a good summary page. Tax-efficient asset transfer, tax-free proceeds for the beneficiaries. If there are some inheritance taxes, then this can help pay for them. Tax-free wealth accumulation in some jurisdictions. So remember, I've said this before, but I think it's worth repeating. In the question stem, the institute is going to have to say, this jurisdiction allows wealth to accumulate tax-free, or some sentence like that. Yeah, look at the first teardrop point here. Lots and lots of financial planners that I know, they love coupling life insurance policies, with trusts. And that second teardrop is really important. Nobody really wants to go through the probate process. So if you name the trust as a beneficiary of the insurance policy, then you don't have to worry about anything like that. We can also create a company, a controlled foreign corporation. What this does is it maintains the controlling interest. I mean, it can be for the investor in that home country. The advantage of these companies, the CFCs, are that there's a tax deferral on income. Depends on whether that earnings is distributed as dividends or until the company is sold. I love this slide and I love this section of the reading because we have, look over on the far right. So you have one individual or, maybe a husband and a wife, they create the wealth, so they're standing up really tall. And then the children, then they hold the wealth. And then the grandchildren, they spend the wealth. And then the great grandchildren, they have nothing left. So that's kind of an illustration that comes through with the problems associated with the sequence of creating the wealth and then not maintaining that wealth or increasing the wealth. And then there's the poor, nothing left for that fourth generation. And so look at the green bullet point there, mitigates the negative outcomes that may arise across generations. And I'm guessing that you have friends or colleagues or acquaintances, or at least of a family business in which, the grandfather and the grandmother, boy, they were entrepreneurs and they worked super hard. And then that desire somehow doesn't flow through the generations completely. Surely there are children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who still have that same drive and that same motivation. But then there are others who don't, and they want to do something else, and that's perfectly fine. All right, so what happens here? There's the creation, the second generation, third generation. So I would probably know that. Wealth dilution, right? Lack of interest in the family business, poor planning and education. And so that's where we come in. Clearly as good financial analysts, we can't come into a family business and say, hey, you know what, Johnny, and you know what, Jenny, you guys, you want to do something else? Well, no, we recommend that you get into the family business. Of course, that's not our job, but what our responsibility is to educate, right? The Institute, they want us to educate our clients, and that education then leads to way more efficient planning. And so the end result of this reading is that we have excellent tax planning and we have excellent and efficient estate planning. Now, what I love about this, the Institute takes its basic function and tools from crafting a policy statement and applies them to the family governance of a business. So establish values, missions, and vision collaboratively. So you sit down and you talk to all the family members and you say something like, all right, where are you in your life? What do you want to do with your life? Where do you see yourself when you're 40 or 60 or 80? And then we can craft the policy statement, which remember is not a legal document, but then we can put together all of these trust documents and foundation documents and company documents, and we can get the family to sign them. Some of them are going to be binding, some of them are going to be non-binding, but remember, we're going to do lots and lots of monitoring throughout the lifetime. Yeah, so effective family governance. So human capital, that's the original grandmother and grandfather, unique skills, income generating potential, then the family members' knowledge, so intellectual capital, and then social capital. Of course, these wealthy families, they realize that they have worked really, really hard. They've taken tremendous amounts of risk, and it's paid off, and they end up want to share that. So their philanthropic efforts are probably a huge part of this. Yeah, fostering open communication, educating younger members, managing the family's wealth. This sounds beautiful in this kind of a slide, but then you throw in the human element of educating younger members who may or may not want to be educated. Yeah. All right, so what do we have here inside of these wealthy families? Board of directors, we talked about that. A family council, a family assembly, a family office, and a family foundation. I'm guessing that you know what these things are. Conflict resolution, the Institute doesn't ask us to be a therapist or psychiatrist, but we need to make certain that we have, I won't go back to that slide, we have those non-binding and binding documents so that we can refer back to them when we have a conflict. And, this can be super easy or it can get super ugly, but we need those formal documents as a guide to get us through. And then, of course, we need to decide whether or not we want to maintain the business through the next generation or sell it. How are we going to do that? Well, we've got to have some kind of a document that says something like, hey, you know what? some of us want to sell, some of us don't. Let's go ahead and take a vote. I think I referred you guys to watching that great show from the 1970s and 80s, Dallas, with J.R. Ewing. Oh my gosh, J.R. had most of the votes, but he didn't have a majority of the votes. And so for season after season, J.R. Ewing was trying to bribe people and extort people and do all sorts of really, really bad things to accumulate enough voting shares. Now, of course, you can divide, just like companies, you can have shares that have votes and you can have shares that have non-votes. So the non-voting shares, they have access to the income or they have access to the wealth, but they don't vote on those. And so this probably is the result of having a tremendous educational process. So look at these bullet points here. What are each one of these is saying something like, you know what, we're going to get together and we're going to visit. Let's go ahead and talk about this. Let's have somebody from each generation and let's talk about the goals of the business. And of course, the older generation will have a closer tie to the original grandmother and grandfather, to use my example, and we'll say something like, well, Nana and Pop-Pop, they had this idea, and they often said something like, boy, I would love for my great-grandchildren to be able to do this and this and this. And so, boy, that kind of is a waterfall. Let me use a hedge fund analogy there to help us understand, managing wealth across generations. All right, if we're going to have a business sale, what we need to do is try to figure out when are we going to do this. So imagine a family business that has, 4 different units. Maybe they want to sell one at a time, one every 2 or 3 years. Maybe they want to sell them all to one particular buyer. Maybe they want to transfer that ownership to one individual inside of the family. I mean, there are all different sorts of outcomes here, and we need to make certain that we don't have biases. So look at that second bullet point in there. It may display an endowment bias leading to inflated expectations. All right, so what does that mean? Because we own this asset. Let's suppose we're, we have 4 businesses. One of our businesses is we own 100 billboards throughout the city. And, the grandfather says, you know what, that was my first dollar that I generated. And boy, I'm not going to sell that for less than $10 million. And so inflated expectations. Whereas the grandson or the granddaughter might say, you know what, I have a good offer, $7 million. Let's go ahead and take it. So look at the third one, sale negotiations, more complex and challenging to navigate. So that's probably a good term to remember, challenging to navigate. So remember, let's go back to the policy statement. So we've got these constraints on taxes. We have liquidity constraints. We have unique circumstances under those charitable goals. And so all of those things combined can make this challenging for the disposition of the business. And then that, of course, plays right into the timing of it and what I was saying earlier. All right, we can choose a trustee. These can be individuals. This is what I was telling my students earlier, or they can be institutions. Regular meetings. There can be private trust companies. There can be a post-sale of the business. What do we do after we sell? Suppose we sell, 4 businesses. We get 7 or 10 million for the billboard. We get 20 million for the car wash. We get 20 million for the driveway. What do? We coat the driveways of residencies, so we add all that up and you get $50 million. Then what do you do with it? Well, this is great for us as financial analysts because then we get to invest all that or we help all that. But of course, we might have family members who want to say something like, you know what, I want to open up an art gallery. So I'm going to take money from the car wash and open up an art gallery. And then look at the green there. I don't even want to talk about this because this, as you know, can be super ugly. Just go ahead and do a quick search right now as I'm speaking. Tom Brady divorce, and you got all sorts of crazy things happening. We know from Hollywood couples to movie stars to rock stars, boy. So do you have a prenuptial agreement? Do you have a postnuptial agreement? Were the assets acquired before? Were they acquired during? Or how about separation? How about? So you have to answer all of these questions. So I'm guessing what the Institute will do is they'll have a sentence or two describing something here on the page. And then, of course, how about if we have a family member who is an important cog in the family business and they become disabled or they have some medical emergency, and so they continue to live, but we need to make sure we have a living will, right, durable power of attorney, and then a guardian. And that takes us through those final two LOSs. So what I want you to do now is I want you to turn this off. I want you to go get a drink of water, take some deep breaths, and then I want you to go to the problems at the end of this reading. I want you to have your calculator, and I want you to work through these. And what did I say after part 1? Just read through them quickly, 8 or 10 minutes. After part 2, 8 or 10 minutes, read through them quickly. So now we're going to take this as a practice exam, and we're going to have our calculator. We're going to have an open mind. Boy, we took a reading that was super broad and had some good depth to it. We chopped it into 3 palatable components. So you ought to be able to digest this and do well on that, on those problems. So hey, thanks for watching. Have a great day and good luck studying.